I'm Laura Stalker, Avery Associate Director of the library, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming all of you to the Huntington on this beautiful day, and to the Stephen S. Koblick Education and Visitor Center, which isn't even a year old yet. And those of you who've been to conferences before at the Huntington, I think will agree that the seats are a lot more comfortable. I'm especially happy to be involved in this conference for two reasons. One is that it represents, for me at least, a step forward in our happy relationship with the Getty, something that at least Kathleen Salomon and I have been talking about for some time, but it's sort of been talk. And I think it took Anne Blecksmith, formerly of the Getty and now Reader Services Librarian at the Huntington, to get up the courage to take the eastbound lane on the 210 and start, sort of making things actually happen. So I'm particularly happy about that. I'm also very, very interested in the subject matter, not only on its own merits, but I have been for some years now in charge of public services at the Huntington Library, and that's given me an opportunity to watch how our patterns of scholarship and research have changed. Certainly the Huntington, which has been in operation as a research library since the 20s, is modeled on the traditional pattern of the single scholar working with the single text, sort of in a cone of silence, whether printed or manuscript. The emphasis was on sort of canonical materials, textual materials from British and American history and literature. But even in my in Huntington years, my tenure has been short, I've seen the changes and how they're affecting the way we plan services and operate the library, more collaborative research, more interdisciplinary work, more bringing together materials in different formats, including visual materials, and also more interest in disciplines such as the history of collecting, the history of institutions, history of scholarship. These are really having an effect on the way people are approaching our collections and on our collecting itself. Very interested in these trends, and this conference today fits right squarely in the middle of those developments and is making me think in a more concrete way about them. Now I want to stop right now and to highlight two collections in the library that are not well known but are of extreme interest, I think, to this group. One is our own photo archive or photo study collection, which is smaller than the Getty's but complements it in that it's almost entirely British. The other is the archive of Catherine Esdale, who studied and photographed British sculpture particularly during the 30s and 40s. These collections are not well known. They have not until now been fully processed and accessible. We're now making a push to get them accessible, I hope by the end of this year. And when that happens, I will communicate that to our colleagues at the Getty and to members of this group who might be interested in using these materials. I've been asked to make a few housekeeping announcements, and someone gave me a list. Restrooms in the lobby. We have two cafes in this complex, a coffee shop in that direction and a full-service buffet cafe in that direction. Your badges give you full access to the grounds and public galleries. We have two art museums, a library treasures exhibition, a changing exhibition up in the library you might find of interest, and of course the wonderful gardens. In this auditorium, please don't bring in any drinks or food. You're very welcome to get up and leave and come back at any time. Before we get started, are there any questions or Anything at all? Well, thank you for being here. I'd now like to introduce Jennifer Watts, who's our curator of photography.
Thank you, Laura, and good morning, everyone. I think it's a testament to how wonderful this conference is that on a beautiful day in Southern California, in one of the greatest gardens in America, you're all sitting in the gloom of this auditorium. But the topic is anything but gloomy. I'm going to try and... Okay, so my brief, I am the curator of photography here, as Laura mentioned, and before I get started, I just want to thank our organizers, Costanza, Carafa, and Blecksmith, and Tracy Schuster, and also our director of research, who I don't think is here this morning, Dr. Steve Hindle, who is very much behind this conference and having it here. As Laura mentioned, I do curate the photo collections here, which are about 1 million images strong, so we have a lot of experience here in archives. And even though it's a vast collection, we've got a very lean and small staff. We are small, but we are mighty. And I want to point out a few of the colleagues that I work with here that have worked so tirelessly, so enthusiastically, so hard to make sure that our collections are available, not just to our on-site scholars, but to people around the world now. So I'm going to just say a couple names. You raise your hands, you know who you are, and you can talk to any of these people at the breaks because they know a lot more about certain aspects of the collections than I do. So Erin Chase, our Associate Curator of Photography. Anita Weaver, our Curatorial Assistant. Crackerjack Researcher. You have any questions, go to her. Mario Inaudi, who has overseen all of our huge digital projects, and Jessamy sitting next to her, who's our conservator. I see Livia Herschel, who's, I can't believe she's breaking out in a sweat right now because she's got so many collections that have come in the door this last year. And Sue Tyson, our project archivist. And I'm sure there are other people here. I need to mention Diane Benty as well. But these are the true heroes of the archive. Let's not forget. Okay, it's not the curators, it's the people that are doing the true heavy lifting. So I'm going to give you just a quick thumbnail in 10 minutes about our collections here, 10 minutes or less. And the story begins, speaking of objectivity, it's hard to be objective when the money that funds an institution like this comes from a robber baron, which is essentially what it did. So you see Collis Huntington here on your left, one of the big four. Made a vast fortune, $30 million, through the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. That's 19th century money, folks, so that's a lot of money. And he had a favorite nephew, and that favorite nephew was Henry Huntington, who you see here, very savvy businessman, who not only was interested in railroads, but interested in real estate. When Collis Huntington died in 1900, he left half of his estate to Henry Huntington, who this institution is named for. Henry was also the executor of the estate, and he had the good fortune to marry his uncle's widow, Arabella, thus solidifying the fortune, the Gilded Age fortune brought back together. Now, this was a love match, everybody, but what it meant was these people had a lot of cash, and they had a lot of education, and they had a lot of ideas about how they wanted to spend it. They moved to Southern California. In 1910, built this amazing Beaux-Arts mansion, which I suggest that you go look at lunchtime if you can, where they lived, and they began filling it with their collections. Huntington was a collector at heart. He loved collecting. He collected plants. The desert garden is a perfect example, a collection of plants brought from all over the world in a very artificial environment. So please go, and it's spectacular this time of year, so please go see it at lunch. Under Arabella's influence, he collected art, primarily British art of the 18th and 19th century, grand manner portraiture, as well as sculpture and decorative arts. But his love, first and foremost, was books. And he built this astonishing library. Here you see our main hall, which is filled with the treasures, we're calling remarkable works, remarkable times, also something to go see. He built this collection. He was so wealthy he could go to auctions and buy entire libraries, what we call en bloc. And that's what he did. He went and just hoovered up collection after collection, to the point where today we have, and of course, then hired very savvy librarians and curators to build upon his strengths, which were early American, and British history and literature. That's the strength of the collection. Now, Huntington chose to live in Southern California, and so his curators who moved out here, mostly from the East Coast, decided this is an interesting place historically. So we're going to start really focusing on California and the American West. So we, as far as, and this is our general reading room, not our special reading room, but we service now 1,700 scholars on site per year. We give over $1.5 million in grant funding, that is endowed funding, so that those of you out there who want to do photo research, talk to me at the break. We've continued to collect aggressively and assiduously and building to our strengths since Huntington died in 1928. Now, Huntington himself was really not at all interested in photography. Henry Huntington, Collis Huntington, interestingly, used photography in a very savvy manner to sell the Transcontinental Railroad. He hired photographers, he used photography in service of his project. Henry, not so much. That said, because we're a rare book library and because we've brought things in through a kind of aggregation over years, we have a collection now that's about, as I mentioned, 1 million strong that spans the beginning of photography to the present, with very, very strong emphasis on California and the American West, but with other real high notes. Early British photography, the grand tours, and we're still discovering, frankly. But the real emphasis is California and the West. And here's an image by Carlton Watkins, one by the great fine art photographer Edward Weston. So we have both documentary, commercial, and fine art photography in this collection. Over the years that I've been working here, we've been working hard to do public exhibitions and using both of our historical and fine art photography. This is an exhibition that I did on panoramic photography that I think people are still, our facilities people are still freaking out about this ramp that was in the gallery. And another one that was done in 2008 on using both documentary and fine art photography on the history of Los Angeles photography curated out of this collection. We've been able to do a number of publications which showcase the collections. You see here it's a real range from the American Civil War, Strange and Fearful Interest, which we did not so long ago, to the photographer for House Beautiful, Maynard Parker, and Edward Weston in our LA. And just for the purposes of talking about archives, this is an excellent example, which I hope we'll talk about a little bit later today. We got the entire archive of the Southern California Edison Corporation, which 80,000 images. The Edison Corporation, which funded the scanning of it, wanted every image scanned pretty much. So we scanned 70,000 images, and they're available online to all of you, sitting in your jammies in the middle of the night. So please. But what we did at that point after we scanned everything was we brought a group of very diverse scholars, artists, thinkers, curators together to look at the collection and build mini exhibitions, mini online exhibitions based on the material. And it was incredibly eye-opening. We had everything from architectural historians looking at the vast array of architecture to a fantastic writer who made a whole noir film, sort of filmic series based on what he was finding through this archive that was created for the Southern California Edison Corporation to demonstrate to themselves the better art of living with electricity, essentially. So with that gives you just the most sort of cursory overview of how the collections grew and developed and what we're doing here today at the Huntington. And I'm very, very excited for the papers today and for the rest of our conversation. So I will turn it over. Oh, there's an Edison image for you. With that, I will turn it over to Anne Blecksmith. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank my collaborators, Tracy and Costanza. I think this has been one of the best collaborations I've ever worked on, and all of the speakers who have traveled from near and far to present at this conference. It has given me a lot of energy ever since yesterday's excellent discussions, and I'm looking forward to today's papers. A couple housekeeping things that we went over yesterday. We're going to be following the same format, 25-minute papers followed by a brief Q&A, and then all of the speakers will join each other in a 30-minute discussion. We gave you a little bit of a longer lunch given the site's logistics, so you can experience some of the Huntington while you're here. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker since we're running a little behind schedule. So if Friederike, if you're ready to come up, go ahead. Friederike Maria Kitschen received her PhD in art history at the University of Munich with a dissertation on Paul Cézanne. Since June 2015, she has been the recipient of a research grant from the Greta Herkel Foundation in Dusseldorf, where she's preparing a book-length study on popular art historical book series. From 2014-2015, she was a scholar in residence at my former place of employment in the Getty Research Institute. She's been a visiting professor in art history at the Technical University of Berlin, scientific project coordinator and curator at Humboldt University Berlin, a scholar at the German Center for the History of Art in Paris, and director of exhibitions at the Kunstverein Friederike, we're looking forward to hearing your paper, The Not-So-Private Photo Archives, Photography of Art and Series of Popular Gallery Albums in the 1860s. Welcome, Friederike.
Thank you very much, Anne, for this kind introduction. I would first like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me. When I was a Getty scholar last year, Thomas Watkins told us that he never knows if the Huntington is Arcadia and the Getty is paradise, or if it's the other way around. It's not my turn to decide it right now, but I must say I'm very glad and very honored that I was now invited both to paradise and Arcadia. So thank you very much. If we talk about photo archives, we usually refer to public archives in universities or to the private collections of scholars. I would like to enlarge the notion and talk about the so-called museum at home. It was a very common idea in the 19th century that also the great public should collect photographs of artworks. The Getty, for example, keeps not only the impressive photo collection at the GRI, but also in the Getty Museum, a unique collection of early private albums which contain photographs of famous buildings and artworks. And all those people who did not want to collect themselves could buy from the 1815 onwards ready-made photo albums in the book market. This is a field I want to focus on today, art photography for the great public, and especially some popular photo albums published in the 1860s in Berlin. In 1857, a group of distinguished German art historians welcomed one of the first German books completely illustrated with photographs, The Cathedral of Mayence and Its Monuments. In the leading art journal, they called photography a magic art, praised its immediacy and its, quote, unerring truth, unquote. One of them confessed that he had almost forgotten looking at reproductions instead of the original side, and another one remarked, photography, in its stoical strength, is a proper medium for the scientific historical presentation. But not only scholarly readers could enjoy such a fine rhetoric of authenticity. Also the larger public was addressed, for example, in the popular satirical journal Münchner Punsch. Here we read, "We have a facsimile, a mirror-like picture of the original, with the only difference that it does not cost a tenth part of it. Soon every citizen will be able to put some masterpieces on the walls of his living room, instead of many bad lithographs and electrotypes. For example, the alter ego of an original work by Raphael or Rubens. The family will thus enjoy something really good, the collection will grow, and a common sense of art should arise. The public should thus educate itself not only by merely looking at art photographs, but also by collecting and displaying them at home. However, our author is not talking about photographs made from original monuments, but from graphic reproductions. He somehow tries to distinguish the different levels of mediation using the term mirror-like picture for the technique of photography, facsimile for the truthfulness of both graphic and photographic reproductions, and eventually alter ego for the thus produced hybrid photographs, as I would like to call them, of the original paintings. Mainly because of the color blindness of early photographic material, art photographs made from black and white graphic reproductions were the most common thing at this time. But while it was still evident and mostly mentioned in the 1850s that they should substitute graphic reproductions, they were often marketed and reviewed simply as photographs of the most famous paintings in the next decades, and sometimes until today, perhaps because the fact does not fit very well into the narrative on early photo pioneers. Moreover, many of these photographs have disappeared. Already in the late 1860s, they were considered as mere third-hand images and became completely old-fashioned by the end of the century. They were thrown away or substituted by pictures which were made directly from original paintings and considered more authentic. And with the hybrid photographs, some of the companies that specialized in them fell into oblivion as well. One of them was the Photographical Art Institution by Gustav Schulze in Berlin. Founded in 1851, it quickly became one of the leading commercial producers of art photography and exported throughout Europe and the United States. Schulze consequently specialized in photographs of paintings. In 1858, he offered 500 different works in 3 sizes, among them the popular carte de visite for private photo albums. And in 1864, his stock already contained more than 1,000 different motifs. No, that's too early. In the British Art Library, I found a very rare early catalogue that you see on the bottom right. It shows that Schulze mainly focused on old masters' paintings. They constituted about 60% of his stock. His photographs were reviewed enthusiastically. The Journal des Beaux-Arts praised them as good and cheap pictures, quote, that bring all the museums of the world into the hand of the working man, unquote. The Fine Arts Quarterly called them, quote, true copies of the great works of the greatest masters, and welcomed them as a timely and valuable contribution to the cause of popular art education. What many critics did not even mention, most photographs were, of course, made after black and white reproductions. Schulze's commercial as well as educational attempts did not end with loose art photographs. He began to produce photographically illustrated albums with explanatory text. This was, of course, not a new idea, as we heard already yesterday. But many early albums were expansive books and addressed a scholarly public. Schulze, however, combined the idea with another one that was already successful on the popular book market, the edition of a complete series of uniformly laid out volumes. They could be produced and merchandised collectively and sold at a reasonable price. His first series appeared from 1860 onwards and contains no less than 24 albums on old masters, such as Titian, Raphael, Leonardo, Dürer, Correggio, Murillo, Rembrandt, and so on. Each album contains at least 10 album and photographs mounted on cardboard. The texts were written by renowned German art historians, and Schulze, who had realized that his public was not only interested in art, but also in art history, proudly entitles the series Kunsthistorischer Zyklus, Art Historical Series. His second series of albums appeared around 1865 and leads us even more into the idea of the museum at home. The gallery cycles comprises 11 albums on famous European galleries: Berlin, Dresden, Munich, Vienna, and Venice, Florence, Madrid, St. Petersburg, and London, Paris, and Kassel. Unfortunately, this series has almost perished, and I was glad to find at least 6 albums in the University Library of Würzburg, who made the scans for me. Again, each album contains 10 album and photographs. They come along with short text written by the then popular art critic Ludwig Pietsch. Here you see the album of the Berlin Gallery. It starts with a painting that looks a bit like a work by Margaret Keane, but was then attributed to Correggio. Next come Raphael's Madonna Colonna, Titian's Daughter Lavinia, followed by Maria with the Saints of Andrea del Sarto. Oops, does not work. A St. Anthony of Murillo, one wing of the Gantry Table by the brothers van Eyck, the Raising of Lazarus by Rubens, the Entombment by Van Dyck, and eventually Rembrandt's Samson, here still entitled Duke of Geldern, and the Paternal Admonition by Gerard Terborch. The Dresden album starts, of course, with Raphael's iconic Sistine Virgin, followed by the famous Holbein Madonna that was identified as a copy just around this time. Then come the celebrated Holy Night by Correggio. I try again. No? I think you can see it. Titian's Tribute Money, a Madonna by Murillo, and a small version of the Marriage of Canaan by Veronese. A Magdalene by St. Anthony, at the bottom left, by Battoni was included, and at last again paintings by Rubens, Van Dyck, and Rembrandt. The National Gallery London shows us, among others, a so-called Leonardo, in fact a work by Luini, another Correggio, another Murillo, another Van Dyck, a Sebastiano del Piombo, a Poussin, and the British painters Hogarth and Wilkie. In the album of the Prado, you see again paintings by Raphael and Titian, by Rubens and Murillo, now surrounded by other Spanish masters, Velázquez, Alonso Cano, and Ribera. And in St. Petersburg, we find no surprise, once more, Raphael, Rubens, Rembrandt, and Murillo, now joined by Guido Reni and some Dutch masters. As you may have seen, all photographs were made after graphic reproductions. Mr. Pietsch, however, simply informs his readers, the following images give a selection of the main works in true photographic copies. Only once he identifies a graphic template, and then he's even wrong. For the photograph of the Van Dyck in Dresden was obviously not made from the engraving by Mandel, as he tells us, but from one that you see on the right. It was made before 1851, and so, according to the Prussian Copyright Act of 1837, that protected artworks and prints for 10 years, its copyright was yet extinct in 1864. Let's hope the same for the Madonna Alba. The engraving by Metzmacher, of which I could find no exact date, was published by Ernest Gambert in London, who was famous for taking proceedings against photographic piracy. Definitely free of copyright, however, was this print of the so-called Leonardo, again published by Gambert, an engraving by Felsing made already in 1847. Also for the Dresden album, Schauer used older prints, for example this lithograph of Correggio's Holy Night, which was widely praised for its clearness and truthfulness. And most prints for the Berlin album he simply took from a complete series of lithographs that had appeared around 1843. The Madonna Colonna by Raphael, the Lavinia by Titian, the Entombment by Van Dyck, the Rembrandt, and the beloved Murillo that I show you next to a photograph of the painting before its destruction in 1845. These lithographs are so similar to the paintings, at least if we do not worry about color and size, that they must have been made directly in front of the originals. And because the photographs minimize their sizes and unitize their smooth gray tones once more, they may appear, at first glance, like photographs of the original paintings. These were exactly the kind of highly mimetic and objective prints that Schauer wanted to reproduce by photography. He obviously preferred them to other reproductions that were more subjective interpretations by the graphic artists, such as these two examples on the bottom. However, I must admit that the etching on the right side interprets the eponymous rage very well, even better than Rembrandt himself. Schauer's efforts were honored. Critics praised the, quote, charming clearness and precision of his images, leaving it open if they referred to the prints or to the photographs or to both. They affirmed that he had used only the, quote, best and truest prints, unquote, and that his photographs were much better than the, quote, usual woodcut illustrations that never reach this exactitude of the reproduction of the originals, unquote. We are still speaking, I must remind you, of photographs made from prints. Photographs made from original paintings we can only find in the last album, The Castle Gallery, which Schauer joined the state-of-the-art experiment of the mid-1860s. Not only had foreign companies such as Braun or Alinari already started their photographic campaigns in European collections, also the upcoming photographic company in Berlin got permission to make pictures in the Berlin Gallery. Schauer had to keep up. As a proving ground, he chose the gallery, the Castle Gallery, that had just opened for the public. The album includes a family portrait, now attributed to Peter Foppesson instead of Hans Holbein, a Magdalene by Rubens, now identified as the later copy, The Boys Making Music by Franz Hals, a portrait of Saskia by Rembrandt, an interior of a church, a very photogenic work, The White Peacock by Peter Hondekötter, a Cleopatra by Titian, now attributed to Lamberto Sustris, The Dying Sophonisbe by Guido Reni, not by Gino Redi, but by Nicolas Renier, and the Mater Dolorosa by Ribera. This time, our author, Peach, speaks at length about the illustrations, quote, the majority of these paintings were never reproduced in engravings or lithographs before, and also in this respect, the Castle Gallery is a terra incognita. It was thus impossible to illustrate the album with photographs made from yet existing reproductions of their best original paintings, unquote. Schauer had to make pictures of the original paintings, and this caused, as Peach informs us, all the well-known problems. Most colors, and likewise the deep golden harmonies of many paintings, could not be reproduced. Therefore, some of the gallery's most celebrated Rembrandts could not be included in the album. Moreover, darkened and yellowish varnishes obscured the photographs and made important details invisible. On the other hand, many irrelevant and troubling details were relentlessly shown by the photographs, the scratches, cracks, and dents on the painting's old surfaces. Thus, Peach resumes. Such a clean smoothness, sharpness, and spotless elegance, which makes the photographs of engravings and lithographs so very dear to the layman, and to which we are accustomed through their immense circulation, are indeed missed in these reproductions made directly of the originals. But we firmly believe that our public's artistic education of senses and taste, as well as its knowledge of the essential, are already advanced enough, so that it may willingly abstain from these convincing but inessential qualities. If we only give him images of the immortal works of art, images that show the miraculous touch by which the master animates his creation, and which can be rendered and kept only by the natural force of the photographic process. Images that mirror the expression of his heads, the flow of his light, the characteristic touch of his brush, in a truth and authenticity that no other technique may achieve. This is a long but revealing sentence. He first refers to the current opinion that photographs of prints were the most adequate form of illustration for the layman. Also, the art historian Wilhelm Lipka rated such images shortly as, quote, aiming at the taste for the great public, unquote. Photographs made after original paintings, however, he valued quite differently. Photography gives a mechanically true copy without the mediation of another one's eye or hand. Therefore, the result does not primarily serve aesthetic consumption, but rather the art historical interest, and one willingly desists from the fact that the overall impression almost never correlates with the original work. That's art history. The supposedly unmediated, mechanically true photographs of original paintings, you see one on the left, were thus seen as adequate, even indispensable tools for art historical research. They represented a kind of raw materials for scholars whose trained eyes were able to objectify from their distortions and to diagnose the, quote, immediate deposition of the original. At the same time, the faults of the photographs positively approved both their own authenticity and the objective method of the scholars. The, quote, stoical strength and ruthless exactitude which was attributed to the photographs, their, quote, uncorruptible account, unquote, should characterize the art historians themselves. For the not-so-trained eyes of the layman, however, the hybrid photographs did better, especially because they joined the two media, truthful prints that nevertheless selected the relevant details from the irrelevant ones, reproduced in photography a media that was surrounded by all these ideas of authenticity and verisimilitude. By this means, a kind of double trustworthiness was generated. Hybrid photographs were comprehensible and memorable, and therefore suitable for an educational attempt that relies on recognition and on display of the relevant and not on confusion and an oversupply of details. Moreover, hybrid photographs were appropriate because they were credited to render the spirit of the master, and therefore considered to address both the mind and the soul of the beholder, quite different to original photography that was often characterized as cruel, cold, and lacking any soul. And in most contemporary concepts of mass education, an emotional access to art was seen as essential for learning. In the Kassel album, we can, however, observe how this dualism changed. Not only was the great public now granted with the capacity of estimating and reading more objective photographs, but at the same time, these photographs were seen as more and more capable to, quote, show the miraculous touch by which the master animates his creation. But beyond their epistemic amenities, there was still another reason for the persisting use of photographs of mimetic prints. In the 19th century, both the research of scholars and the interest of the great public in art history rose quickly. This came along with massive processes of canonization. For the public had a deplorable tendency to stir an Italian salad in its private albums, where Dave Flies stood next to immortal masterpieces as a German critic raged. Ready-made albums, however, wanted to control the salad. They gave a selection of masters and masterpieces that was coined by the canon, and at the same time, they were themselves major agents of canonization. Schauer's gallery albums, for example, suggested representing the most important works by the most important artists in the most important galleries, a triple canonic choice. The squad of the great masters was equally confirmed by his first series of albums, which included mostly the same names. And at the same time, the selection was sanctioned from outside by renowned critics who praised the painters as well as the authors as luminaries and defined the complete series as well-rounded. Even though the word canon remains unspoken, the idea is evident, as well as the inherent claim for its objectivity. It is most obstructive for such a canonizing attempt if important works cannot be reproduced for technical reasons, such as Rembrandt's masterpieces of the Kassel Gallery. Photographs of prints were in most cases simply better available and thus remained indispensable for the museums at home for many years. But not only popular albums were coined by the canon. In a revealing letter preserved at the GRI, the German art historian Hermann Grimm lists his basic needs for the forthcoming photo archive in the Berlin University. Quote, I would try to procure first and foremost, and as complete as possible, the material to study the work of the so-called great masters, Giotto, Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, Titian, Holbein, Dürer, Rubens, Rembrandt. Moreover, he asked for the photographic publications of the museums in Oxford, London, St. Petersburg, Madrid, Munich, Dresden, Copenhagen, Weimar, Bale, Brussels, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, and the Louvre. And eventually, he wants to consider, quote, the masters of the second grade, such as Giulio Romano, Correggio, Mantegna, and others, and some more galleries, such as Venice, Padua, Verona, and so on. This modest starting kit largely depends on the same canon of masters and galleries that had already featured in Schauer's albums. But at the same time, Grimm claims a substantial enlargement and thus a certain completeness. That is, I think, a typical attempt for professional art historical photo archives. So at the very end of my talk, I wish to draw a short parallel. Like the hybrid photographs of selective prints, the publisher's photo albums were a curated media that gave a handy and canonical selection, an essential selection to the public. And like the so-called unmediated photographs of originals were raw material to scholars who could decode their relevant information, professional photo archives too provided and represented raw material, a supposedly complete offering for scholars who can differentiate between the main strands and the byways of art history, objectively, of course. Thank you.
Take off with this microphone if you want to stay. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question for our speaker, and then I will make my way down for questions from the audience. So thinking about the discussions yesterday and your talk today, I started thinking about ways that text and the images work together to create a didactic product in these albums, a didactic product in the album. And were the photographers working with scholars, or how were judgments made? And who was writing all of the introductions, the captions, or were the photographers interested in art history?
The photographer was the publisher himself. He started as a photographer, and then at the moment of his career, he joined a couple of famous art historians in Berlin. And I don't know who decided to make these albums, but they are deeply coined by this circle of art historians. So Schauer made these photographs. He had a couple of these photographs in his stock, and then they were used for the albums. And we have no records on these gallery albums, which are very, very rare. But we have at least some prefaces in the other series, and there the art historians sometimes mention the selection of the photograph, which they made together with the publisher photographer. So, for example, for the Holbein album, it's a very interesting case. There did not exist enough photographs, and they made black and white oil copies in order to get the most relevant paintings by Holbein. And this was a decision of the publisher photographer Schauer and the art historian Alfred Woltmann, who was rather famous at this time, a specialist on Holbein. So we really have this connection between photography. But I think I have no archives of this Gustav Schauer, and I just have the dates of his birth and death. He became an artist later himself, and so he must have had a real interest in art and art history.
Thank you.
Thank you, Friederike. It was really very, very interesting. I didn't know anything about these albums. Thank you so much for having brought them to the general attention. I was wondering if you have any clue on the context of their use, because they are, of course, now in institutional collections. Do you have any, I don't know, ex libris on them, or do you know of some of them in the provenance, and do you know other books or photographs or objects that were in the same home, so that you can reconstruct from the other side their use, not only from the side, from the intention of a Schauer, but from their actual use. This is probably difficult.
I think we have the price of the albums, and it was in the most expensive version was 10 marks. This was at this time a reasonable price for a middle-class family, and these albums were rather representative, so they were bound in cloth and gilded. You can see this. So we can think about the public who could buy it. It was not the working man, of course, in the mid-19th century. Today we can find some of them still on the book market. So there must be, I don't know the numbers of copies, but most of them are now preserved in university libraries. And sometimes the photos are cut because the album photographs faded, but the art historians were famous, Gustav Wagen, Hotto, Woltmann. So I think these university libraries simply kept the text and threw away the faded photographs. And, the gallery cycle, which is really extremely rare, we have some copies in London, in the British Library, has a wonderful collection even of these early German albums. And because Schauer exported from the beginning to London, and he was rather famous there. And you can see in the corner this catalog I found in London. We have no copy in Berlin. And the 6 existing copies I found in Würzburg belonged to a private collection. And this was a kind of, how to translate it in German, a Beamter. He was working for the government, of the Bavarian government. And he had a nice library, but he was not an art historian. He was a layman, as Peach would say.
I'm coming, Susan.
I might perhaps mention that the Kassel album, the one with the original photographs, we have some more copies. So I think the other one were simply thrown away, and the text by Peach was not so famous. But we have some more copies of this album with the original photographs. So you see that it was highly estimated.
I have a couple of questions. Do we know if these albums came as far as the States? Where people were studying art history or getting ready to go on the grand tour or things like that. Is there evidence that they were sold here?
Yes. When I was here at the Getty, I used the interlibrary loan, and I got some of these albums that are only here. The Dürer album, for example, we don't have in Germany anymore, not with photographs. And also the Rubens was only in Houston. I don't know why. And so there was an exportation to the United States, and this is mentioned in some of the reviews. So I think as soon as it was, we have also 1 or 2 with English texts. So he was producing for the English market, and also we have one in French with a French text. But we have much more copies today of these rare albums in the US than, for example, in France.
And do you think these were precursors? In the late 1800s in Paris, a lot of the early artists who worked in multiple prints, lithographs and etchings and so on, created small albums of their work. This was very popular. Do you think there's a relationship between the albums that were created in the late 1800s by artists, well-known artists, working in multiples, and this earlier sense of an album?
I don't think so. I think that he really used etchings and engravings, as I showed you, that were on the market, that were rather popular, where the copyright was extinct. But this was a kind of, common market. There were no, I guess, a pre-selection of artists' albums. If I understand you right, I have a problem to understand it because the microphone is
Oh, I'm sorry. In the late 1800s, artists in Paris created their own albums. Artists who were doing multiples, various kinds of prints. And they would have 8 or 10 or 12 prints in an album. And maybe the concept of the album started with something like this, that the artists in Paris took up. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but it's really a question not of understanding, but of the acoustics. And if I understand you well, there were artists in Paris making their own albums. And the rest escaped me. It's but I can't see.
I just wondered if this concept of album started here with your albums.
The story starts a little bit earlier in early 19th century and in Paris, but this was also a professional publisher, Paul Landon. This was still illustrated with etchings. But the big difference, I think, for the book market and for the distribution was that these are ready-bound volumes that could be sold such as a book. So you had the selection. And all the series that appeared before were deliveries and fascicules. And so it was not such a pre-selection. And I think this is the point I want to make clear, that this, the public should be educated, but at the same time there should be control. And this control was both by photographs after prints, because these prints controlled the information of the picture, and by such a bound volume which gave the people this selection made by art historians, by scholars, by the publisher. So this is this kind of double control.
Okay, I'm going to ask that we hold questions in the interest of time for the discussion, and I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Thank you, Friederike. This was a wonderful, enlightening talk. Okay. Our next speaker is Casey Riley. Casey is the Von Hess Curatorial Research Fellow at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. She holds a doctorate in American Studies from Boston University, where she completed her dissertation, From Page to Stage, Isabella Stewart Gardner's Photograph Albums and Development of Her Museum. A chapter of her dissertation appears in Elizabeth Edwards and Christopher Wharton's edited collection, Photographs, Museums, Collections Between Art and Information, published by Bloomsbury in 2015. Casey is also co-curator of the upcoming special exhibition at the Gardner, Off the Wall, Gardner and Her Masterpieces. She's a contributor to the museum's forthcoming guidebook, to be published by Yale University Press in 2017. And I'd like to welcome Casey Riley.
Thank you, Anne. I'm going to add my thanks to the chorus for this incredibly wonderful two-day symposium. I feel very fortunate to be here amongst so many of my photo historian heroes and heroines. On December 9th, 1894, the co-founder and first president of Radcliffe College, Elizabeth Kerry Agassiz, wrote to the art collector Isabella Stewart Gardner about a request for a photographic portrait. While Gardner was nearly consumed at that point by what she called the picture habit, a euphemism for her preoccupation with acquiring masterworks of fine art, which she compared to a morphine addiction, she nonetheless maintained a strong interest in collecting photographs, especially portraits of her accomplished friends. In response to Gardner's request for such an image, Agassiz writes, "I have not forgotten the photograph, but I find one taken many years ago, as I would rather send you the old lady whom you knew than the young one whom you did not know. I am inclined to wait, and perhaps after the holidays make an attempt, if I can summon courage. It is a little like going to execution." Yet Agassiz's courage must have failed her, or else Gardner prevailed upon her to send the younger portrait instead. The cabinet card, which you see behind me, that Gardner retained for her collection shows Agassiz in the early 1870s in Carlton Watkins' studio in San Francisco. This portrait photograph, like so many others in Gardner's possession, eventually traveled from her Beacon Street home in Boston, Massachusetts, to the museum she designed and built between 1899 and 1901. On the raw edge of the newly developed Back Bay fens, Gardner tended the blossoming of a pink stuccoed domestic enchantment whose galleries were meant to transport visitors from frosty New England streets to the perfumed atmosphere of a dazzling Venetian palazzo. When her museum opened to the public in 1903, Gardner had spent over a year arranging her collection of fine and decorative art, rare books and manuscripts, and a wide array of archival and photographic material within its galleries. The resulting synthesis was heralded by her friends as an aesthetic revelation, quite in the line of a gospel miracle, as William James would exclaim. And in her will, Gardner famously contracted her installations for perpetuity. She then dedicated the museum to the public for their, quote, education and enjoyment forever. Per Gardner's original curatorial scheme, the galleries of her museum contain 15 glass-topped cases holding an extraordinary collection of archival material on permanent display, including numerous and prominently featured photographic objects. These cases were installed by Gardner from the time of the museum's opening and served as ongoing repositories for the founder's personal correspondence, as well as collected photographs, literary manuscripts, and other memorabilia arranged over the course of her lifetime. Like her travel albums and guest books, which she also placed within the galleries of her museum, these photographic exhibitions map the evolution of Gardner's influential friendships and patronage over the long arc of her career, and materialize a vast web of professional connections for visitors to examine today. At the same time, the photographic assemblages within the cases furnish evidence of Gardner's ambitions for her public memory and illuminate the centrality of the photographic object within her strategies of self-commemoration. While the masterworks of Botticelli, Titian, Rembrandt, and Rubens command the center stage at the Gardner, photographs like the one of Agassiz form an eternal audience for their performance and remind museum goers of the impresario behind them. Most crucially, Gardner's photographic installations present the social history of the museum as a critical part of the visitor experience and memorialize the vitality of the institution's cultural life and leadership at the turn of the 20th century. The location and installation of these archival cases reveals their pivotal role within the overall design of the galleries. The historic building of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, which was known as Fenway Court during the founder's lifetime, contains 18 unique gallery spaces spread over 3 stories and around a central courtyard garden. The museum holds a world-class collection of art from Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and the continental United States, and due to Gardner's last will and testament, these works are fixed in unchanging arrangements. Gardner wrote guidebooks for the museum from the time of its opening, and the names that she gave to each gallery have been used ever since. Most of these names carry thematic cues. The Titian room showcases Europa, and the walls of the tapestry room are hung with a selection of the Barberini tapestry collection, but still others describe key aspects of the gallery's interior design. The walls of the first floor blue room and yellow rooms are covered in azure and marigold jacquard, and the third floor long gallery is a space that stretches the length of the building from north to south. Most of the archival cases are located in these 3 galleries at the bottom and the top floors of the museum and contain assemblages of thematically related material. The cases in the blue room, for example, hold photographs and correspondence related to Gardner's closest friends and associates. The cases in the yellow room hold photographs, programs, scores, and other materials related to her musical interests. Finally, the long gallery contains a sweeping series of photographic and archival arrangements encompassing Gardner's political, historical, artistic, literary, and theatrical enthusiasms. Because the yellow and blue rooms are located near the original entrance to the museum, and the long gallery was the final public gallery on the 3rd floor during Gardner's lifetime, visitors would encounter the archival cases and their photographic contents at the beginning and at the end of their visit. The cases therefore provided an introduction and a conclusion to the original viewing experience, and were framing devices for the imaginative experience of exiting and re-entering the 20th century over the course of the museum. As every visitor to the Gardner Museum can attest, the galleries provide an experience of sensory immersion in which the fine and decorative arts of cultures spanning the millennia are presented in defiant synthesis, disregarding categorization by era, national boundary, or school. These same principles of integration governed her strategies for presenting archival objects in the galleries and were preceded by her display of photographic materials within the spaces of her home at 152 Beacon Street, where she lived until she moved to the fourth-floor apartment at her museum. Historic photographs of the drawing room at Gardner's home in the late 1890s show arrangements of cabinet cards and other photographs placed before some of the most significant works in her collection of fine art. Photographic portraits of the musicians who peopled her social networks stand on a table set in front of a self-portrait of Rembrandt and Botticelli's The Tragedy of Lucretia, their borders overlapping in a two-tiered arrangement. In another shot of the same room, photographic portraits are intermingled with luxuriant objets d'art and peep from behind the fronds of an extravagant potted palm. Most of the photographic portraits in the drawing room at Beacon Street would make their way into the cases in the museum's yellow room. Historic photographs of these cases reveal arrangements that bore some similarities to the displays in her Beacon Street drawing room. In the two cases in the yellow room, photographic portraits of musicians and performers are ranged along the back walls of the cases, with others intermingled with letters, drawings, plaster casts, and other objects. From these cases in the yellow room, a range of celebrity composers, conductors, and performers peer up at the visitor. Johann Strauss leans next to Johannes Brahms in a single photograph, while a youthful Ignacy Paderewski and a midlife Karl Muck peep out from between visiting cards, envelopes bearing stamps, and a life mask of Ludwig van Beethoven. Close examination of these portrait photographs reveals the dedications of these performers to Gardner, and the abundance of personal letters literally materializes the depths of her relationships with them. As she did at Beacon Street, these photographic assemblages were integrated into her presentation of works of fine art. The cases in the yellow room are surrounded by original paintings by Henri Matisse, Edgar Degas, James Abbott McNeill Whistler, and John Singer Sargent, including Degas' portrait of the dancer Josephine Gauguin and Sargent's portrait of composer Charles Martin Loeffler. Because many of these paintings pertain to music or musical performers, the thematic associations between the contents of the cases and the paintings around them is clearer than their prior installation at Beacon Street. Gardner's exhibition of portrait photographs at Beacon Street was far from revolutionary. 19th century parlors were typically used as the sites for the display of collected artifacts, including photographs and other curios. What is striking about Gardner's drawing room is not the presence of the photographic object, but the apparently vast aesthetic and material distance between the photographs and the received value of the works of art surrounding them. Although the photographs themselves are of people and not art, these domestic tableaux would seem to measure the critical distance between what Walter Benjamin identifies as the exhibitionary value and the aura of works of art and their reproductions. When seen as a total installation, the quotidian nature of the photographic objects within Gardner's parlor serves to amplify the shock of seeing the blue-chip paintings in the background. In a world of reproducibility and easy image production and acquisition, in other words, the era in which Gardner lived, some things remained singular, and Gardner's Beacon Street installations pointedly illustrate the differences between original works and objects of mass production. At the same time, these photographic installations invited the viewer to experience remarkable objects of the past while remaining firmly rooted within the context of the relative present, thereby heightening the aesthetic and affective encounter overall. The transition of these and other photographic objects from Gardner's home to the museum necessitated their rearrangement, and many of the photographs that she selected for exhibition would lie flat instead of standing. Therefore, the so-called top layer of the archival cases was and remains the visitor's primary visual encounter with her photographic collection. It must be noted that these top layers have been disrupted by modern conservation and other interventions. The museum is now interested in restoring the original aesthetic of the cases and relies upon both historic inventories and photographs to recreate these exhibitions. These historic photographs show that in Gardner's time, the top layer exhibited the antithesis of didactic presentation, favoring a collage-like approach instead, in which an exuberant jumble of photographic portraits, numismatics, hair jewelry, book bindings, letters, and textiles presented an enticing spectacle for the visitor. The visual tumult of these horizontal assemblages echoes the vivacity of her installations of fine art within the galleries and underscores the hands-on character of Gardner's curatorial strategies. The material relationships evident within the top layer of Gardner's archival cases recall the aesthetics of the photographic assemblages in guestbook albums that she created between 1893 and 1919, and the functions of those albums within her cultural milieu paralleled their counterparts in the cases. Inscribed with autographs, postprandial banter, and after-party witticisms, the guestbooks contain hundreds of intimate snapshot photographs of Gardner, her friends, and her family at her Boston area homes, at the Palazzo Barbaro in Venice, and ultimately at Fenway Court. Because her friends and associates provided the content of the guestbooks, those albums activated the networks in which Gardner circulated and anointed her album's co-creators, viewers, and recipients as collaborators in the development of her civic enterprise. As socially networked photographic objects, the guestbooks helped Gardner to assemble her unconventional civic persona within an ever-broadening community of allies who would become crucial supporters in the mission of her museum. The gallery cases therefore may be read as a continuation of a social networking practice that began in a mobile graphical format and as fixed exhibitions of those practices within the permanent curatorial scheme of her museum. These photographic exhibitions not only commemorate those networks, however, but lay bare the processes of cultivation that amassing her collection of art entailed. Creating a museum as a single woman at the turn of the 20th century was no small matter. When seen in this way, the archival cases exhibit not only Gardner's successes, but expose the means by which a woman accomplished her institutional goals in an era that had only begun to embrace the notion of women as leaders on a national scale. The cultural work of her guestbooks transferred directly into her curatorial strategies for the archival cases. Consider, for example, her installation of the Berenson case in the Blue Room. In this assemblage, Gardner placed a youthful photograph of the art historian who was critical to her collection of masterpieces, Bernard Berenson, on top of a fat stack of letters from him. On the top layer of the same case, she placed a signed letter from the poet T.S. Eliot, another autographed letter from the founder of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Henry Higginson, and a photographic portrait of abolitionist and social reformer Julia Ward Howe. Beneath these objects, letters are piled like so many layers of sediment within the case, the name Mrs. Gardner visible in multiple crevices. These letters and the two photographs that adorn them communicate the intimacy and access that Gardner enjoyed among some of the leading intellectuals of her time. In doing so, and like her guest books, the gallery cases provide photographic evidence of Gardner's social and intellectual networks throughout the most important decades of building her collection and museum. At the same time, they demonstrate Gardner's collaborative approach to recruiting institutional stakeholders, as she literally enshrined the evidence of her most admired friendships in the galleries of her museum. Perhaps most importantly, these arrangements imply a critical connection between her institution and the leadership embodied by each consequential personage, heightening the stature and status of her museum by association. The gallery cases communicated Gardner's understanding of the cultural and historical impact of the people featured within the cases and exhibit her grasp of contemporary social issues. In some instances, the thematic relationship between the contents of the cases and the fine art installed around them may be perceived only by understanding the history of certain key objects or figures. For example, Gardner's exhibition of the photographic portrait of Julia Ward Howe would at first seem at odds with the disparate legacies and personalities of her neighbors within the case, particularly Berenson and Eliot. Yet her exhibition of Howe in this instance might not have been determined by her company within the boundaries of the case, but by her portrait's proximity to a large painting hung above it. Anders Zorn's Omnibus is a painting that Gardner first saw at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, and she purchased it on the spot. Omnibus presents the startling vision of a heterogeneous crowd on modern public transportation, foregrounding a single, alert young woman holding a rounded parcel or satchel in her lap. The evident mix of classes and genders sitting shoulder to shoulder conveys the realities of urban life in Paris in the 1890s and underscores the increasing independence, mobility, and visibility of women across the class spectrum within public life. Gardner's choice to place Howe's photograph beneath this painting becomes more significant in light of the latter's activism for women's social and political emancipation in the 19th century. Howe was a strong proponent of women's unchaperoned traveling, and in 1891 became the first president of a unique organization in Boston known as the Women's Rest Tour Association. This organization promoted women's independent domestic and international travel and published multiple guidebooks for would-be female travelers. By juxtaposing the portrait of Julia Ward Howe with a monumental painting devoted to women's mobility, quite literally their forward motion, Gardner provides a trenchant historical and cultural allusion to museum visitors. At the same time, she deftly asserts her support of progressive causes embodied by the women within and beyond the archival case, and associates the installation in toto with the concept of women's emancipation. Gardner used the archival cases to exhibit artifacts pertinent to her cultural leadership, and in doing so, she presented a visual testament to the civic mission of her museum. Her installation of the cases in the Long Gallery is particularly revealing on this point. In the first case that visitors encounter in that gallery, Gardner arranged a series of letters and photographs related to American presidents and other statesmen, cardinals of the Catholic Church, scientists at Harvard University, and geographical explorers. A number of the letters displayed were purchased or inherited by Gardner or her husband, including autographed missives from Benjamin Franklin, John Quincy Adams, and Aaron Burr. But many others were acquired by dint of her personal relationships with the leaders in question. In a historic photograph in one half of this case, photographic portraits of Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft are signed and dedicated to Gardner herself, and handwritten letters upon the Museum of Comparative Zoology's official stationery bear the signature of its director at Harvard University, Louis Agassiz. Women's names are notably absent from this assemblage, save one exception, that of Mrs. Gardner, whose name is not only visible in the salutations and envelopes for these letters, but whose cultural leadership is commemorated in a medallion from the Hispanic Society of America in the lower left-hand corner, directly beneath the double portrait of John Hayes Hammond and President Taft. Gardner was inducted as an honorary member of the Hispanic Society of America by Archer Huntington in 1903 to recognize, in his words, her highest civic to art related to Spain. By literally inserting herself into this assemblage, Gardner places her work as a collector, museum founder, and curator on par with that of the men surrounding her, and exhibits her accomplishments for visitors to that gallery. At the same time, this installation in the Long Gallery presents a visual argument for understanding her museum as a partner to other important American and international organizations. Gardner had great ambitions for Fenway Court and created it to answer a perceived need in American society. As she wrote to an acquaintance in 1914, "Years ago I decided that the greatest need in our country was art. We were largely developing the other sides. We were a very young country and had very few opportunities of seeing beautiful things, works of art, etc. So I determined to make it my life work if I could. Therefore, ever since my parents died, I have spent every cent I inherited, for that was my money, in bringing about the object of my life. What I save goes to the upkeep of my ideal project. The photographic portraits within the gallery cases are not merely evidence of her support in this project, but her effort to position her collection and museum amongst co-equals in the civic sphere. Gardner's friends understood that she was a collector of photographic portraits and often sent her pictures for permanent display in the museum. Multiple letters in the modern archives of her museum attest to the processes of solicitation and gift-giving that characterize the building of her photographic collection. In a letter from 1906, a friend of Henrik Ibsen writes to Gardner to give her an autographed portrait of the playwright. He writes, "This last photograph of Ibsen with his autograph on the back I thought might interest you. My country recognizes his valuable services as a reformer whose writings have caused far-reaching changes, contributing much towards free, untrammeled thinking and acting, especially in the alteration of women's position in society." Gardner apparently appreciated this gift as she placed the photograph of Ibsen in a case with other contemporary authors in the Long Gallery. An undated letter from William James Jr. offers her a portrait of her friend, the author Henry James, stating that, "I am bringing you herewith the portrait of Uncle Henry. If you should find yourself disappointed in it, please send it quickly back to me. My feelings will not be hurt. If, on the other hand, you are still kind enough to like it, please do me the honor to accept it as a gift. There could be no reward more grateful to me than the knowledge that it is in your possession." The honor that Henry James's nephew describes in such ardent terms is notable, and gestures to a broader understanding of Gardner's archival assemblages as commemorative or memorial devices within her museum. At the same time, the participatory nature of building her photographic archive reveals a collaborative side to her curatorial praxis. This flexibility and real-time integration of contemporary materials into the broader scheme of her galleries stands in contrast to the standard characterization of her institution and reveals the dynamic nature of her material strategies in the early 20th century. To achieve an integrated analysis of the Gardner Museum requires the consideration of sources drawn from the social and material life of its founder, a woman who traveled widely, networked avidly, and collected scrupulously. These sources, correspondence, print ephemera, and memorabilia, but above all the photographic portraits that she arranged throughout them, were not incidental to the life of her museum. They were archived by Gardner herself in the galleries of Fenway Court, and they illuminate the evolution and mission of her grand civic project. Most importantly, the archival cases reveal the pivotal role of the photographic object and concomitant archival strategies in the preservation of her institutional legacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. So I found that fascinating, and I have some questions for you. I found these assemblages almost like, in many ways, they're almost like contemporary art or these mini orientation galleries. And she obviously had a natural affinity for arranging things. And thinking about some of our speakers' comments yesterday, Glenn, Paul, Melissa, others, it seems like the sensory quality of these assemblages was the most important, and she wanted to elicit some sort of a feeling or an emotional response. But I see that as connected to her personality. And was she thinking about what kind of a takeaway the viewer would take from these, let's say, cases? And was it really about how was she really sort of doing, I don't know how to describe it, like public relations in a sense, like for the viewer not only to connect with the art objects, but to connect with her?
Yeah. So I guess I would say first that part of what draws me to Gardner is how much we can't really know about her intentions. I don't know how much anybody in the audience is familiar with her archive or her legacy, but she, towards the end of her life, burned a lot of her letters and lots of materials. And so anything that we have was kept very intentionally. So working from what we have, I guess I would say two things. One, I want to unpack a little bit the notion of what she was naturally drawn towards. A lot of what I say about Gardner is that it's not so much that this sort of genius narrative that she just, wow, had this thing. And she was also a person in her time. And a lot of the material processes and practices that I see her engaging within are really rooted in a lot of common practices for 19th century people who liked making albums were doing very similar things. The difference with her is that she took all those practices and made a big, giant museum for all of us to walk around in. And so we can live in her album forever, which I think is very cool. As for what she intended as a response from people, I think one of the most exciting things about our archive is that she kept a lot of letters from just regular people who would come to the museum. And so we know the kinds of things and the kinds of people who she really wanted to reach. We have a letter from a woman who thanks her for letting her bring 60 public school teachers from Lynn, Massachusetts to the museum. These aren't stories that we generally talk about when we talk about Gardner, and we should, because I think she wanted people to be moved by the museum, and she wanted everybody to come. Even though I think we get hung up on, how public was the museum in her lifetime. It wasn't as public as it is now. But, a lot of things have changed since 1924, so I'm comfortable with that.
That's very interesting. I mean, I see that the assemblages are almost in a way like she's doing some self-editing, and Laura and Jenny, feel free to disagree with me if I get something wrong, but I think that that's also the same with our founder. We don't have much of his personal correspondence. Allegedly it was burned by a relative. He rarely gave speeches or wrote anything. So although we have all this stuff, we don't really know much about him.
Yeah, think little, or what is it? Think much, say little, write nothing. That there's a bathroom tile in the Gardner Museum on the 4th floor that she had. It's like her little inspiration. It's like, don't let them know what you were thinking.
All right, I'm on my way down. I might adjust my approach after coffee so you guys don't watch me doing so much walking back and forth. Kelly, you had a question?
Okay, Kelly.
I'm interested in the relationship between the formal portraits taken,
Yes.
obviously in portrait studios, et cetera, and the amateur snapshots.
The snapshot, yeah.
And I know you didn't have time to talk about that, and I was just wondering
Yeah.
if you have a theory about how they were used.
I-
You do.
I
know
do,
you
yeah.
So if you could tell us a little bit about that, I'd be
Thank
really
you.
interested.
That's a great question. Yes, I've thought about it a lot. When I wrote about her guest books, I spent a lot of time thinking about the nature of the snapshot and also thinking about how much more we really need to be writing about snapshots, but that's another story. I think that I want to say the mobility and the spontaneity and the intimacy that one can access through the snapshot illustrations in her guest books stands in contrast to these more formal assemblages, for sure. But I think what I landed on in the end when I was writing this was that, in the same way that she is formalizing a lot of practices that went into her album's construction by creating a museum that's like grounded in those practices, it makes sense to me that she would use studio portraiture for those displays. I want to say too, though, that there were snapshots, or there were more informal portraits. The top layer, these things, when I said layers of sediment, I'm not kidding. I mean, we're talking, this thick, some of the stacks, and layered into some of those are photographs. So, for example, I ended up not talking about the so-called Whistler Sargent case, but there are a number of photographs that are fairly informal. They're not snapshots because they're platinum print, but they're nicer, whatever. Anyway, they're more informal, in the moment kinds of photographs, and they're just stacked into letters in there. There are a couple of cyanotypes. I also have to say the Gardner Museum, because everybody there wants to talk about paintings and like all the fancy things, and nobody's ever looked at any of the stuff, really seriously, the archival stuff. There's some really great photographs there. Like Edward Steichen came to visit Gardner and brought her some photographs. And there are a couple of platinum photographs given to her by Marion Hooper Adams, Henry Adams' wife. We think that most of her photographs are destroyed. We thought most of them were at MHS, Mass Historical Society. There are actually some at the Gardner. So anyway, I think what I'll say in the end is that Gardner had she had sort of a way of hierarchizing things in terms of, what got put on display, what was prioritized. It doesn't surprise me that she would have landed on professional photography or studio portraiture for the galleries of the museum, and maybe put some of the snapshots on the insides of things.
What kind of digitizing projects are you doing with both the letters, the photographs, and the art?
I'm looking for where you are. Can you raise your hand? Oh, here. Okay. Hi.
Digitizing projects at the Gardner.
Yeah. So we're at the very beginning of this, and we have just hired a digital strategist for the museum. So I would say, where are we with this? We have embarked upon a large cataloging project. Many objects are now in that catalog. Because a lot of the things at the museum we've changed a lot of practices in recent years in the last decade, mostly because before, I think the attitude was this is a museum that doesn't change, so there wasn't really an interest in doing some of the stuff that we would consider professional practices now. In terms of projects that are happening now, I am very much a proponent, and all of us in curatorial are really interested in seeing a hidden collection push, or to hidden collections push to digitize these cases and then make them accessible in some way. What form that takes is still we're literally at the beginning of that conversation. Time, money, resources, vision, all of those things. So a lot of this hasn't been done yet.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting, and I'm so grateful that you explicitly mentioned the question of gender. It is beyond all our photographic topics important to reflect upon the fact that not in the Middle Ages, but 100 years ago in our society, it was not common that a woman is on an omnibus together with other men, and so it is still important to think about these kind of things. But coming back to Gardner and her photographs and archival installations, I would stress even more what you already did in your title to make a case, the fact that these photographs were no more displayed on a table in an environment that is home, even if home of a certain level, but they are put in a case. So the case is a display, a museum display, but also a kind of treasure, and so they are all together because they are not typical museum cases where you would see single photographs and pieces, archival pieces laying, and all of them are visible. The particular thing, as you told very clearly, is the mass and the layers and sedimentation of documents that are displayed. So it is, in a certain sense, the display of an archive, not the display of the single archival objects, but the display of the archival conglomerate.
Yes.
In a certain sense. And I also have a small question, if you can say something about the photographs by Joseph Pratt that we are seeing. So was that just documentation of these objects or of the entire museum?
Yeah, thank you. The idea of formalizing and therefore, I don't know what, conferring importance to these things is really important. I think that got cut in my longer version, but it needs to be baked into the longer, or when this is expanded. As for the Pratt photographs, I do want to say I've done a lot of work on the long-standing relationship that Gardner had with the Mars. The firm of Thomas Marr and Company, they actually photographed her home at Beacon Street, and then they photographed Fenway Court, and they continued to be the official photographers until the 30s. Pratt came in and was the photographer and did, reproductions of the works of art as well as installations and other things, but we don't know a lot. In contrast to what we know about the Mars, we don't know as much about the practices that Pratt engaged in, although I recently met one of his sons, who was a delightful man. The cases were not a priority. There were a lot of things at the museum that kind of, I don't know how much you know about the history, but we had what was called the second Chinese room. There was a first one that got moved to a second place, and that all got deaccessioned and sold in the 1970s. The 1970s was also the same time when they formalized the archive and moved a lot of this material in the cases into another space, but now it's been reinstalled. Anyway, it's kind of a mess. I won't get into it. But we don't know a lot about the documentation. We know that it happened in the 40s and the 70s. We know that it was pretty scattershot. As you can see, the photographs are not super quality. I really can't say more, but it's something that I thought about a lot. I almost could have just written about how these cases have been neglected and photographed, and how we are now working from the Pratt imperfect photographs to create whatever they used to be. But that would have been, I think, the sort of ground level understanding of the cases is important before you get into that other stuff. So anyway, not a perfect answer, but it's a good question. It's something I'm thinking about.
Thank you, Casey.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for your thoughtful comments and questions.